Well, thank you again. A warm welcome again. We're here to talk about the situation actually in Eastern Europe, at the border and in Ukraine and Belarus. This is a town hall format. We've got only 45 minutes. And my main task here is to facilitate the exchange between you, the audience, and participants as well, and our dear guests and panelists. To my right, I have Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya. She's one of the leaders of the opposition in Belarus and the Karlspreis Laureate of 2022. Welcome. And we also have Carlo Masala. He's a professor for international relations in Munich, an expert for security policies, actually, in the war in Ukraine. Welcome. My name is Isabell Hoffmann. I'm actually working for Bertelsmann Stiftung, and I'm an expert in public opinion in the EU. And I just want to throw out two numbers when it comes to support for Ukraine right now. On the one hand, support for Ukraine, as we measure it in several questions, is very high and quite stable. On the one hand. On the other hand, what we also see is that there are very high levels of anxiety right now. So two things can be true at the same time. A determination on the one hand to support Ukraine and Ukrainians in their effort to fight for freedom and democracy, but on the other hand, worries and anxieties are very high on what the situation actually means. And I'd like to bring you to the debate, and maybe you can relate to these numbers as well, and we can check back and see how the situation actually is and how we really should feel about it. So let me, as an introduction into debate, turn to you, Ms. Tsikhanouskaya. For more than a year now, all eyes are on Ukraine, right? And in your present, this somehow does not feel right, actually, I have to say. So let me start by asking, how are Belarusians doing right now? How is the opposition doing? How are the people doing? How do they cope with this situation? Yes.
No, actually, I would like to tell you that the situation is getting better, but I can't say so. Because now Belarus is facing dual crisis. On the one hand, it's a really humanitarian crisis in our country. The number of political prisoners is growing. And when the war has started, 90% of Belarusians told that we are against the war. So we supported Ukraine in this invasion of Russia to Ukraine. And since then, not only those who have been opposing the regime, but also those who were supporting Ukrainians became enemies to this regime. So our partisans who disrupted railways to stop Russian equipment going to Ukraine, Russian equipment, they now in prisons. People who sang Ukrainian songs or put Ukrainian flags in prisons. People who have been donating to Ukrainian army in prisons. So now people actually have to fight against the regime and against the war. And simultaneously they are declared as extremists, terrorists, just for helping Ukrainians. And this is a massive terror that's going on in our country. On average, about 11 people every day are being detained in prison. Our political prisoners are kept in incommunicado mode, when lawyers for months can't reach prisoners, and lawyers are deprived of licenses, and we don't have access to our friends, to our beloved in prisons. I haven't heard from my husband for more than 2 months. Recently, presidential hopeful Viktor Babarika got to hospital. He was rather beaten, and there were liquid in his lungs. But since then, we don't know anything about him, where he is he alive at all? Masha Kolesnikova, who's a member of my team, together with Veronika Tsepkala in 2020, she's also kept in somewhere, maybe in solitary cell, because we don't know what's going on with there. And thousands and thousands of people in prisons, from 3,000 to 5,000. 60,000 went through prisons, tortures, rapes. So it's really humanitarian catastrophe. On the other side, we see creeping occupation of Russia. We see the presence of Russia in economic sphere, in media sphere, in cultural sphere. And it's like at the moment when Belarus now is a little bit overlooked, you know, Russia, Lukashenko is selling our independence to Kremlin because Lukashenko has to be loyal to Kremlin. Putin saved Lukashenko back in 2020 and now then became an accomplice to Putin when the war has started. And now, like, Lukashenko is on the leash to Putin and has to fulfill all the duties, all the orders. So the situation is difficult, but the good I don't know, so-called good news is that Belarusian people are not giving up. There is no change in mood of, in perception of the situation of Belarusian people. People didn't stop to, I don't know, love Lukashenko. People are fighting for freedom and democratic changes in our country. Yes, undergroundly, you can't see big rallies, you know, on Belarusian cities because of the massive repressions. Hundreds of thousands had to flee Belarus and continue their fight from exile. You know that all alternative media in Belarus have been ruined, all possible NGOs have been ruined, but these people managed to restore their activity in exile and help to launch different initiatives, to work with international organizations, to create pressure on the regime. We are looking for support to civil society. We need the resources to not only to survive, but to win. So I see this internal inspiration, you know, among Belarusian people, and of course we understand that the fate of Ukraine and fate of Belarus are intertwined. That's why it's our obligation as neighbors, as a close nation, is to help Ukrainians, because victory of Ukrainians for sure will open new window of opportunity for us Belarusians. So our task is not just to sit and wait when brave Ukrainians, you know, will win, but we create as much pressure on Lukashenko as possible, simultaneously helping Ukrainians. You know that hundreds of military volunteers are fighting in Ukraine. We have people surveillance in Belarus, people providing us information about a movement of Russian troops. So many initiatives that may be not invisible, but they are working. They are helping Belarusians to keep Lukashenko in constant stress. Maybe I will stop here. Maybe I'm too long, so thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's fascinating. I'd like to I'd say in a certain way, determination is still there. The fight is less visible. It has become a little bit quieter because the situation is so much more difficult actually now with the war situation in Ukraine than it was actually before, and lots of Russian and the presence of the Russian regime even being more visible and important actually than it was before. Let me turn now to you, Professor Masala. When we hear about this this quiet but determined and very courageous fight that's a little bit more quieter on the Belarusian side, and the very visible fight that we are so impressed by now for so many months on the Ukrainian side, you know, there's I think one question imposing right here: are we doing enough to support them? And is our attitudes towards their struggle the right one in order to grant their success?
That's a difficult question to answer because there are certain limits to support the Belarusian opposition. I think we're doing a lot. Yes, the focus has shifted. It has shifted from the situation there to Ukraine. I think there is still some room for diplomatic pressure which connects Belarus to Ukraine. And that's a question whether Belarus will enter the war or not. So this is pending since February. I personally don't see Lukashenko giving in to the demands of the regime in Moscow, because he knows that probably this will be the end of his stay in power. Because as you said, there is a lot of opposition to the war coming from the civil society, but we know that even the army is not very keen entering the theater in Kiev, in Ukraine. There is something we could do more in terms of sanctions and pressure, and this has to do with the latest development, Russia announcing to give launchers and tactical nuclear warheads to station them in Belarus. This is not a deterioration of the security situation. It's more something like one of the many attempts of Putin to actually threaten us with nuclear escalation. But definitely, if Russia gives these kind of missiles and the warheads, if Russia hands them over to the Belarus army, this is a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if this happens, we should put much more pressure on Belarus because we have an interest in Belarus itself, but also an interest in keeping the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is almost dead, but at least a bit alive. So I think there is still some room. We should not forget about the situation. But on the other side, our options are limited right now.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question. I just would like to encourage you to jot down your questions, because the next time I look around, I hope to see a lot of hands so that I can bring you into the exchange. So how about the situation in Ukraine? How do you look at it right now?
The military situation?
Yeah, the military.
Well, basically everyone is expecting the offensive of the Ukrainians, and there are, what I would say, unrealistic high expectations about what this kind of offensive could bring about. So since a couple of weeks, I'm always trying to tell people who ask me to lower their expectation, because this is not going to be an offensive from the playbook on the big front. We will see some minor actions. It's going to take weeks, if not even months, before this offensive really plays out. Ukraine has a limited number of soldiers. The Russians had enough time to fortify the defensive positions. So everyone who expects a kind of offensive we saw in the end of July, where basically, the Ukrainians were able to break through the front was collapsing, and they penetrated deep into Russian-occupied territories. This is not going to happen this time. So it will be much slower. Ukrainians have to be well prepared. That's the reason why the offensive hasn't started right now. Everyone is waiting basically, day to day that this offensive starts, and the pressure is extremely high on the Ukrainian army. But I think Ukraine has a limited number of soldiers available. If they start the offensive, they have to do it properly. So if they need some more time, we should give them the time and not put this kind of, public opinion pressure that we want to see this offensive. So it's not gonna be quick. It won't show the successes we've seen last time in July, and we have to give the Ukrainians time to basically prepare their offensive.
What would be the best outcome? And the worst, once we're there?
The worst outcome is that the offensive fails, and then basically we have not a dramatic change in the situation, because I think the consequences of this is that those countries who support Ukraine will get a bit of exhausted. And the US is going into presidential elections by summer or autumn in full swing. So not even the Democrats are going to stick their head out to support massively Ukraine if the offensive fails. So there will be diplomatic pressure on Ukraine to come to the table, to accept certain losses of the territory. I think that's the worst outcome. The best outcome is that the Ukrainians are able to separate the southern from the eastern front. And this is important to put a hell of pressure on Crimea. And if the Crimean Russian front is about to collapse, not because they're going to be attacked directly, I think the Ukrainians would be stupid to do it because it's a dangerous thing. But you can cut off the Russian armed forces in Crimea from total logistic, and then they're going to be under pressure and about to collapse. This might change things in Moscow, and Moscow then comes to the negotiation table. So that's the best outcome. The worst is that the offensive fails.
Okay. I'll have follow-ups, but how about you?
forgotten to look to the international dimension, or to the international architecture, which is also changing enormously these days. How do you see the prospects there of, let's say, other players, you know, getting stronger and even replacing the West, in terms of a player, or the key player, one of the players, in bringing about, let's say, structured results to this war? I mean, is the G20 framework, Lula, Modi, these kind of countries and their interests, are they going to shape also the international architecture through G20 and maybe even the UN, which is in coma in so many ways? How does all this play out in one of the 2 or 3 scenarios which you have on your mind?
Well, I'm pretty skeptical about this kind of aspiring regional hegemons that they are going to bring, or that they're having, let's say, a leverage in the conflict. The only player I see is China. So, and China might, of course, start an initiative where Brazil and India are on board too, so in the framework of the BRICS without the Russians. But actually, the only player who has some kind of leverage on the Russian side and even on Ukraine is China. And what I would expect is that at the end of the day, we will see some kind of negotiations chaired by China and the US. So, which of course, I mean, if you look at China, the interesting thing is that China so far has always been extremely reluctant to play the role of a broker in regional conflicts. I mean, they did it once in Sudan, but their investment was directly threatened. And now they do it on 2 fronts. I mean, they're getting more engaged in the Ukraine-Russia scenario, and they brokered the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So for me, this is a clear sign that China now enters the 3rd stage of becoming a global power. I mean, after, you know, the economic phase, then the military phase, now it's a political phase. And so if someone is about to bring change, then of course China is the player, one of the players, the US and China. I don't see Lula, I don't see Modi or whoever will be the next Turkish president having enough power to basically bring both sides at the table.
Two questions. One, if you can put your brain in the brain of Putin, can you imagine what he is thinking about right now? The second question is, what are the real political situation inside Russia that can influence the conflict?
The second question I would pass to you because I'm not a Russian expert. I think the problem is that Russia and even Putin probably has realized that he already lost the war, but he can't stop it. And that's the problem. So, I mean, with all the information he has, I mean, there's no way that he doesn't realize that actually he has lost the war already, politically, economically, but even militarily, he has lost the war. But he's the guy who can't stop it because he started it. So, and that's the problem. We are since months into it. Yeah? So, of course, I mean, the best outcome would be that, I mean, honestly, he dies or he will be replaced. Yeah? I don't think replacing Putin means a total change, because this is a neo-imperial regime. But the best possible outcome would be that we get a kind of 1970 scenario when the Bolsheviki came into power, and the first thing they did is they basically left the First World War. So, not that the regime changed with the ideology, but probably they're going to realize that it's better to stop the war than to continue the war. With this guy, Putin, I don't see any change. And this is what I mean when I say, you know, the key is Crimea. If Crimea comes under pressure, I can imagine that there are going to be some changes within the regime where at the end of the day, Putin will no longer be in power.
Second question.
As for Russian people, I'm also not expert, but maybe I'm closer to Russia. You know, for sure, what is evident is that still most of Russian people are supporting Putin and supporting this war. I think that the Russians for many, many years have been poisoning with the chauvinistic and imperialistic ambitions. That we are winners, we are the best nation, we have to restore USSR, you know, no one country from post-Soviet Union countries don't have right to choose their future by themselves.
Are you talking about the Russian politicians or the people?
The same. People are also of the same opinion. You know, Ukraine is not separate state. They are part of Russia. Belarus is not separate state. It's like a worse version of, I don't know, of Russians. They are not nation. You know, they don't have right to choose European future because they belong to us. As if we, it's the same situation among people. Of course, there are small groups of, you know, opposition, you know, in Russian society, but the majority of Russians are still supporting Putin. They can't, you know, they can't realize that they may lose, for example, this war, and understanding that Putin uses Russian nation as cannon fodder. He doesn't take care about people's lives at all. But you know, this idea, imperialistic idea, is like crazy thought, you know, is spreading through the whole Russian society. And I think even after, you know, changing a person, you know, in the government, it will take decades, maybe hundreds of years to change people's minds.
I mean, one thing I can add is, this is from the military perspective, that Putin so far, or the regime so far, has been so clever to leave the ethnic Russians out of the war. So, I mean, the ethnic minorities are dying there, not the ethnic Russians. The longer the war takes, the more he needs to mobilize. There will be a situation where he can't basically avoid even to mobilize the ethnic Russians. And this, of course, might change then public opinion if the ethnic Russians are getting the coffins back. Yeah? So we know from Afghanistan, I mean, when Gorbachev came into power, we have the protocols of the first Politburo meeting under Gorbachev, and the main issue was defection from the Soviet army, because at that time, the mobilization was all over the country. And the moment you get to the ethnic majority, and they're losing their children, they're losing their husbands or their brothers, this might cause some kind of civilian protest, which might threaten the regime. But as long as he's able to avoid this, the situation will be extremely stable.
But it is a dirty mental trick, right, to link the faith of the leader with the faith of the people. So in a certain way, they take them prisoners in this sort of situation, because the messaging is, if I'm going down, you're going down too, right? I mean, the mental movement would be for the people to kind of understand that that's not true. And I'm definitely no Russian expert, but from what I know about the media situation, then it's extremely difficult.
Well, but this is a society which has been brainwashed since years. Yeah. And if you look at the development from February to today, I mean, colleagues who are dealing with Russia, they are discussing right now the question whether Russia can be called a fascist state. No longer an authoritarian state, but already a fascist state. And this shows a lot what is going on in Russia. And I mean, we have all the experience of Germany. I mean, majority of the Germans, even in January, thought that Germany is going to win this war.
Yeah, maybe in this regard, I also want to underline the difference between Belarusians and Russians, because Belarusian society also was tried to brainwashed during the years of governing of Lukashenko. But the fact that we were rather close to Europe, Belarusian students got opportunity to study in European universities. We got opportunity to travel a lot. We just moved forward, society moved forward, and Lukashenko stayed in this Soviet Union era, and he always dragged our country back. Society wanted to develop, and he's dragging us back. And when the war has started, you know, even those who are maybe somehow supporting the regime, they definitely realize that Belarusians are not Russians. We don't have these imperialistic ambitions. We don't have anti-nationalistic moods. You know, we are very close to Ukrainians as nations, and our Nobel Peace Prize winner Ales Bialiatski told once that closest nation to Ukrainians is Belarusians. So we fully understand each other, and you know, as we said, there are no anti-Ukrainian moods, no among society, no among Belarusian army.
Of course, thank you. Thank you for your patience. No, I'm sorry, you have to pass the mic one step, because she has been waiting for quite a long time. Sorry about that, but I got you on my list.
Okay, so I'll give it back to him. I'm Erica, the Executive Director of the Fulbright Commission, giving out scholarships, and this is for Sviatlana to understand a little bit more. A few months ago, you recently set up a office in Brussels, and so the office, of course, for the democratic nation of Belarus. And so I was curious, I think you've opened up several more of these offices, and it was a little bit more to check in to see how these offices are taking hold. Are other you know, countries recognizing them? Are you able to engage in this diplomatic way from these offices?
Thank you. You know what we are doing now? We are trying to institutionalize relationship with the nations, with countries, with government. We understand that Belarus now is in a rather tricky situation when Lukashenko lost legitimacy. He's not recognized as a leader of Belarus, and there is like leader in exile, government in exile. And our task is to install relationship with the many governments and to help Belarusians. And we try to open offices of democratic forces in different countries to help Belarusians, first of all, who live on this territory, and to be in better communication with the countries. Me personally, I can't communicate all the time, so I share responsibility with those who are on the ground in different countries. I open the doors for them. We have joint meetings with the parliaments, with the ministers, and then this office take responsibility and work in the region. And I'm really grateful to those countries who help us in opening these offices. They understand why it's so crucial, for us. It's about recognition of democratic forces, recognition of Belarusian nation as the voice of Belarus. It's not Lukashenko who can be like representative of Belarus, but people. Yes, now we can't be in presidential palace in Minsk, but we are fighting, to be there. But we have to install this relationship also in advance, because we really want to be a reliable partner in future, and we will have, when this period of changes will come to Belarus, we will have already 100,000, of friends all over the world, and institutionalized relationship with countries.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Julian Romaneshin. I'm a former fellow of Charlemagne Prize Academy and currently fellow in the Academy of International Affairs in Bonn. Two questions. First to Carlo. You mentioned 2024 presidential elections in the US. If we are confronted with the scenario of the US either withdrawing its support or retreating its leadership from the European theater, do you see any prospect of Europeans stepping up in light of the long-standing objective of building strategic autonomy in security and defense? And a second question to Sviatlana. Ukraine has broken diplomatic ties with Russia on the day one of the invasion, on the first day of the invasion last year, but hasn't done so with Belarus, despite Belarus' direct involvement and facilitation of war. Do you think it's a good idea to keep diplomatic ties open between Ukraine and currently Lukashenko's regime? Thanks.
Shall I begin? I mean, we have to step up, full stop. And we should have done it already when Biden was elected. Because either outcome will have consequences for Europe. If you read the national security strategy of the Biden administration, it's very clear that Europeans have to take more responsibility for their own defense. Because even Biden wants to concentrate on Asia. So if Trump comes into office, or a Trump-like person, then everything will become much quicker, and the lights are going off here in Europe much quicker. We are not prepared for this. We lost time, basically. We are not prepared. We need to step up. We need to start thinking how to do best right now, because in any scenario, even a next democratic administration will not stay to such extent in Europe as they do right now. I mean, we have a presence, US presence right now because of the war. I think the last time it was in 2013 that we had more than 100,000 combat troops and all the material and the stuff and the logistics here in Europe. This is because of the war. Once the war will be over, even a democratic administration will reduce the presence of the US massively. They're not going to withdraw the Article 5 commitment, they're not going to withdraw the nuclear umbrella, but they will basically withdraw the troops. And the burden of containing Russia will be mainly on our shoulders. So, and therefore, in one or the other way, we need to prepare for that and we need to take up the task.
Sorry, is there any realistic scenario we're going to do that?
Well, we have all the means available. The point is, there is a lack of political will. And if you know, the moment we are... Yeah, but the moment we are naked, yeah, we have to do it because there is no alternative. And the moment a guy like Trump comes back into office, or a Trump-like figure, and travels to Brussels like Trump did the last time, and doesn't mention Article 5, and you remember last time, after 2 days, someone basically, got it back and said, the president stands to Article 5. Next time, no one will come after and say, it was a mistake, you just forgot to mention it. The moment he basically will not say this magic sentence like the US, is committed to Article 5, they are shutting off the lights. So, and the question is then, you wanna live under the pressure from a nuclear Russia, or you want to stand up against a nuclear imperial Russia? And I think we are going to stand up. It will be difficult, it will be a painful process, but we have no alternative.
Yeah, as for diplomatic relationship between Ukraine and Belarusian regime, I think that there were some steps of this relationship. Lukashenko betrayed Ukrainians. A couple of days before the invasion, he promised in one of the interviews that no one missiles will be launched from the territory of Belarus. In a couple of days, the war has started. Maybe the Ukrainian government at the beginning thought that maybe Putin made him to do this. Maybe, they didn't want to blame Lukashenko because maybe they trusted him, who knows. Then, step by step, that they understood that Lukashenko became collaborant, he became an accomplice to this war. It was his allowance, to provide our territory, our infrastructure to Russians. But it was very difficult and awful first days of the war, when cities have been ruined, awful atrocities, a lot of murders, and I think that the government of Ukraine, they didn't want to open the second front. They didn't they thought that the Russian army maybe might join in a Russian army, and they wouldn't be able to resist, this flank. They had to concentrate their forces on hotspots in the eastern part of Ukraine. Maybe they left ambassador in Belarus just to stay in touch somehow. I don't know if there really was diplomatic relationship at those times, but ambassador was there till I think that only a couple of months ago, Ukrainian ambassador left Belarus. So at the moment, as far as I know, they cut diplomatic relationship, and I think that government of Ukraine at last, realized who Lukashenko is, that he cannot be trusted, that he will betray Ukrainians, in the second time and later, that the only thing he cares is about his own power. It's not Belarusians or not Ukrainians, it's only his seat, his crown, and knowing that only Putin can support him, can save him. So Lukashenko will never be on the side of Ukrainians.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Professor Masala, please, can you assess or give us your assessment on the nuclear option, which Putin certainly has?
Yeah. I say what I say since months. We should not forget that Russia is a nuclear power, but the chances that Russia is going to use nukes are extremely low from all perspectives. In this phase of the war, use of tactical nuclear weapons as a military weapon doesn't make sense at all. Doesn't make sense at all. It won't change anything. So, I always say, if I were Putin, I would have used tactical nuclear weapons the moment the US and Europeans have started discussing so-called heavy weapons. This would have scared us off. Yeah? And we basically would have never sent tanks and armored vehicles to Ukraine, because our society would have been scared to death. So, this is gone. What is the scenario? There is no military option where he can use tactical nuclear weapons. The war will still continue. Just to give you an idea, in 1991, when basically the US-led coalition was about to go into Kuwait to fight the Iraqi army, Colin Powell, you can read this in his memoirs, he basically tasked his staff to look at how many tactical nuclear weapons the US would need to stop the advancement of an Iraqi division. And his staff came basically up with a 2-digit number of nuclear weapons, something like 32, 33, to stop a division. And Powell said this is no option. So we forget about thinking about tactical nuclear weapons. So Putin can't use that high number because the US already said this will have devastating, catastrophic consequences. The Chinese and the Indians are not going to accept it. Basically, if he used this amount of tactical nuclear weapons, he basically will achieve what we, the West, haven't achieved during the whole war. He will be totally isolated internationally, which also means he can't continue the war because he has no political and economic support he's right now enjoying from China and India. So, strategic nuclear weapons against one of our countries is also no option, because at the moment he will use strategic nuclear weapons or a high number of tactical nuclear weapons, it's already said, I mean, all the airports where the strategic bombers are flying off are going to be destroyed half an hour later. The Black Sea Fleet is going to be grounded half an hour later. So there are no options. And what I say is, so far, Putin has been an extreme rational actor. I mean, people think that he's crazy. He's not crazy. You can be rational, but still make wrong decisions based on the information you have. But whatever he did since the 24th of February is based on rational decisions. And he's not going to kill himself, and he's not going to basically kill Russia by using nuclear weapons. So I don't see any realistic scenario where he might use tactical nuclear weapons or strategic nuclear weapons.
May I?
Well, sorry, if I want to say, I won't rule out, and this is something where we have to be prepared. I mean, those of you who are familiar with nuclear weapons know that on a tactical level, the warheads and the launchers are separated. So, I won't rule out that if the Ukrainian offensive is successful, if the Ukrainians are putting high pressure on Crimea, if the Ukrainians are blowing up the bridge, yeah, that we will see the moment when the Russians know that there will be an American satellite in a certain position and the weather is good, that they're going to take out the tactical nuclear warheads. And try, I mean, at least, you know, put them on lorries and bring them to the launchers. This would be logical, yeah? But this doesn't mean that he's going to use them. So it depends on us. It depends on us how to react in such a scenario.
I think for me it was very valuable that you mentioned that even in the beginning of the war he was a rational actor. Because, you know, my first thought was, well, you know, everybody said he's not going to do it, it's not rational, it's, you know, he's not crazy, etc., etc. Then he started the war. So it's, you know, it was good for me that you kind of turned the perspective and said, well, you know, even in that moment, based on the information he had, you know, he took maybe wrong but rational decision.
Yeah.
Sorry. Please,
yeah, I just wanted to look at possible usage of nuclear weapon from the point of view of Belarusians. I don't know if you know that Putin declared that he, together with Lukashenko, will deploy nuclear weapon on the territory of Belarus. So just in case nuclear tactical weapon will be used from territory of Belarus. And counterattack will be on Belarus. So as if Putin, it's not me, it's Lukashenko who put this red button. So it's like really Belarus will become a target for possible attack. So who knows? Dictators are crazy. If they are cornered, they might do this irrational action. So we Belarusians are really afraid of this, and we are asking, powerful countries do everything possible to avoid deployment of a Russian nuclear weapon on Belarus. But now it's perceived like bluffing or just raising stakes that nobody takes this seriously.
No, I mean, everyone is taking it seriously, but it is a bluff. And the important thing is, we don't exactly know, because there is a difference. There is this announcement, and if you read the Russian announcement and whatever the Russians said, and even Lavrov said about the deployment of tactical nuclear warheads and launchers to Belarus, it looks like that the Russians are keeping the control. There is a speech by Lukashenko where basically you can read that the Russians are basically handing these things over to the Belarusian army. And it's not quite clear. I mean, we have no information who's basically in control. I would expect the Russians, but as I said, there is this statement by Lukashenko. You can interpret in the way that he says basically they're giving it to the Belarusian army. And this would make a difference. So the moment it is in possession of the Belarusian army, then of course it would be an attack by Lukashenko. So far, if we assume that the launchers and the warheads are still in possession of Russian units, it is an attack by Putin. And the counterattack won't be on Belarusian territory because it serves nothing to attack Belarusian territory. The counterattack would be still on Russia in that case.
All right. Still serious scenarios. So now the floor is yours. After that, we have to take a last round because I think we're almost or already out of time, but I'm going to push it a little bit because I feel a lot of energy in the room. So, Antje, and then yes, three of you.
I just would like to take a look into the future because, of course, the priority now is to stop this war and to end this war. But even after the war has stopped, Russia will be there. So my question is, what strategy should you now develop for our former relationship with Russia? And what would be, from a Belarus perspective, what do you expect from the EU to be our strategy? How to we about our relationship with Russia in the future?
Was that yes?
You want to start? I don't think that we will have a relationship with Russia for the decade to come. As long as this regime stays in power, we have no guarantee that after a phase where, I mean, right now, latest number is 97% of the Russian land forces are tied in Ukraine. So something like 65% of their land forces are destroyed in Ukraine. They will need some time to rebuild them. So let's give them 10 years. As long as you have this regime in power, regardless whether Putin leads the regime or someone else, you have no guarantee that after this phase where basically they build up the land forces again, you don't have the next move. So I think the main task for a decade to come is to actually counterbalance Russia and Russia's imperial ambition. And I think we will move to a phase. The term is a bit misleading, but it brings a certain kind of picture in the head of most people, or at least of those people who are as old as I am. We will move into a kind of Cold War with Russia. And as long as Belarus is in Russia's pocket, I mean Lukashenko, with Russia and its allies in the region, I think containment of Russia is what we are going to do for a decade to come. And thereby I expect that there will be almost no economic relations. We will keep the sanctions up, or we will have a system of snapback sanctions once there is a kind of a treaty between Ukraine and Russia. Relations on the cultural level, on the civil societal level will be extremely low. So it will resemble much more the relations, let's say, Western Europeans had with the Soviet Union in the 50s and the 60s. This will basically characterize the future.
Yeah, as for Belarusian people, as our country, you know, our future is in Europe. And we want to build closer relationship with European countries. And of course, after changes, we will tie all the deals, all the agreements with Russia that have been made by Lukashenko behind Belarusian people's backs. So I don't know how many years it will take to restore relationship, if it will be possible at all. But Belarus is part of European family of countries, and we share European values, and you know, our future is with Europe.
One thing which will be upcoming to us, if you look at Central Asia and the Caucasus, where basically Russia is no longer able to play its like hegemonic role it did in the past, whether we liked it or not. But there will be a new ring of fire there. We already see it. I mean, it's not by chance that Azerbaijan attacked Armenia the second time during the war, because the Russian bases in Armenia were emptied and all the material was in Ukraine. You see, if you look at Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, you see old rivalries are popping up on a very low level. Kazakhstan basically left the Russian-controlled orbit and went to China. I mean, there's going to be some trouble over there. And I would place today a bet that if we meet in 5 to 10 years from now, Russia territorially will be smaller than it is today. So, because, I mean, there is a kind of deal between Moscow and the rest, yeah, which is basically economic aid, and no political influence by the others. So Russia, as we know, when the war started, had a GDP which was the same like Spain. It's not going to have this GDP again. So the old deal, the economic political deal, I mean, won't play out in the future. I don't rule out that some of these autonomous republics want to break up from Russia, and I would not bet that this will go as peaceful, in vertical commas, as the implosion of the Soviet Union went. So I would expect that actually the center would use force to keep them into basically Russia. And the scenario of having several military conflicts on Russian soil in a country which has 6,000 nuclear warheads is nothing which basically entertains me for the future. It will pay my bills, but it doesn't entertain me.
More trouble ahead. We can now have a last round of questions. You're taking yours? Okay, very quick. 15 to 4 is the next session starting, and we need to stop before that. So.
Very quick, short couple of questions. What do
Can you have one? Because there are 2 other people waiting. Yes. Can you, please?
Yes. What do people think in Belarus and in Russia about the European Union, about the West, and about the US? My first question. Second, what is the message, besides sanctions, towards the people in Russia and Belarus? Remembering the Cold War, we had the Radio-Free Europe. Remember well, Radio-Free Europe. Do we have a Radio-Free Europe today? If you look to Hungary in '56, the outcome was clear, very ambivalent. But what is the message? Do we have a Europe Charter for the Belarusian and Russian people? A Europe Charter.
Okay. So the messaging. We collect now, so that we can
hello. Question for Sviatlana. 3 years ago, there was a coalition of different political forces, which was destroyed immediately after the elections. And 3 years ago, you promised to hold new elections and to release political prisoners. What are the results after 3 years? And do you consider your activities effective? Do you have a strategy and plan? And what's your plan? And do you really believe that you can change Lukashenko after 3 years? Thank you.
Thank you. Please pass the mic behind you. Thank you very much.
I want to go back to the nuclear deterrence, so to say. I fully agree with the assessment, but 2 questions. For the sake of having an effective deterrence in this bluffing situation, one, Do we do enough to make it clear that Zaporozhye nuclear plant falls into that category as well, so that Russia doesn't have plausible deniability to what happens there? I guess we need to elevate it even more so that there is no ambiguity about if anything happens there, that it's the same thing. There need to be consequences. And then when it comes to Belarus and then tactical, understanding that there is no capacity in Belarus to operate that weaponry as well, do you already have a legal determination of effective control that Russia will still retain, so that again, there will be the same consequences if de jure, so to say, it will be Lukashenko using it, but de facto we would know that effective control over the proxy regime is there, so that Russia has a clear signal from the same China or India that if anything happens on that front, that's the same thing. So just to comment on that, and just observation on I mean, listening to all of it and following everything that happens in the region, being part of it, I still think that Europe at times now makes the same mistakes vis-à-vis Georgia as it was with Belarus at some point by not intervening more forcefully with the government of Georgia, the way it drifts away now from Europe, while having Georgian people pro-Western as we have been all the time. It's time to, within the spirit of that competition and containment of Russia, that is unavoidable, to fight for what is within the interests of Europe. So I guess a little bit more needs to be done now in the countries in Caucasus, in Central Asia as well, so that the flank is larger than otherwise it will be when it comes to the Western coalition.
Wonderful, thank you. So I propose we take it backwards. Maybe you start with the question about the nuclear option, then we go to the strategy and we land on the what's the messaging and, you know, how to move forward and be positive force in this.
I don't think that we're doing enough. As you know, reiterating or signaling is the key. So, and after Blinken, I don't know when he did it, a couple of months ago, said this, you know, it's going to have catastrophic consequences, and then you had the Bali summit with the declaration. I mean, it's a bit quiet on the Western front if it comes to nuclear issues. So, my point is always keep that extremely high. Signal to Russia that you won't accept any use of nuclear weapons, whether they come from Belarus, whether they come from Russia, you won't accept it. I would even basically support it by material signaling, which means bringing NATO forces closer to an area where basically nuclear weapons might be used. So, and this is bringing maritime forces into the Black Sea, so that we have this kind of tripwire even in that case. And if it comes to Zaporizhzhia, I fully agree. I mean, we should raise the stakes much higher because this is the plausible alternative scenario, not using tactical nuclear weapons, but simply blowing up the reactor over there, which will cause also a limited catastrophic event, but it's a very clear signal. And if I might say as a last word, my general problem with our strategy vis-à-vis Russia, our means NATO nations, is that we don't do strategy. We accept Russian red lines. And we basically accept that Russia has, let's say, a free hand within Ukraine. So I would tie certain actions of Russia much closer to reactions by us. So I would have said, if you continue this kind of rocket terror, we're going to send attack en masse. Yeah, if you continue this, we basically will encourage the Ukrainians to blow up the bridges or whatever. So we don't do strategy. We don't understand really how military strategy works, and that's one of the major mistakes we did over the past year.
To bring in the last question, if we don't do strategy, we also don't do strategic communication?
To Russia?
In the EU, yes, in this situation, creating meaning, creating a vision.
The point is, the EU has a problem in strategic communication. So, as the German government has, we don't do strategic communication. That's our main problem. I mean, there's a lot of chatter, but it's not the coherent strategic messaging we send basically abroad. And it's true for Russia, it's true for Belarus, and it's true for the rest of the world. I mean, even you look at China. I mean, what is the strategic communication of the European Union and its member states with regard to China? There is none. I mean, this is basically a cacophony, which is happening there.
Strategic confusion, maybe.
Yeah, strategic confusion, yeah. That would be the nice way to frame it. No, we don't have a strategic communication.
Okay, thank you.
You know,
strategy is a hard thing to do, isn't it?
I just want to
You were also
respond a
asked
little
about
bit.
it.
Even if your strategic communication was good, only people who want to hear or listen to these messages will hear it. In Belarus, people are looking for alternative information. They are looking for, they are watching Ukrainian news to know truth about Ukraine. They are, watching Belarusian alternative media, to know what's going on in reality, because they realize that they are fed with propaganda on state TV and state newspapers. I don't know how it's in Russia. I suppose they are continuing to watch propaganda messages, but in Belarus situation is different. And of course, that's why it's so important to develop and to support alternative media. We, in Germany, for example, Belarusian branch of Deutsche Welle was launched just to make investigation movies or to support spreading of Belarusian messages also here. The same can be done in other countries. And very briefly about our strategy, about our hopes. For 3 years, as I said at the beginning, the situation is getting worse inside the country because of repressions. But for 3 years, we managed to keep unity among democratic forces. We managed to find wonderful friends all over the world whose hearts really bleeding, for Belarus, and who became our real good friends. They want to help. Maybe there is a lack of instruments in international organizations to help us. Of course, I understand that my task is to keep people together, to build these horizontal ties with civil society, with initiatives, to create connections between politicians and people. This is my task. Of course, I understand that we are fighting with brutal, merciless regime machine, and they will try to split us, to send people who maybe call themselves pro-democratic but spread different gossips about our movement. Is their strategy, and we have to counter this. And I think I feel support of people. I see that Belarusian people are not giving up. They fight not between themselves. They fight with Lukashenko's regime, and it inspires me for next steps.
Thank you very much. Please forgive me to interrupt you. Please, everybody, big hand. Thank you for being in the debate. Thank you for countering it. The next session starts in literally 2 minutes. Please hurry, because otherwise I'm going to get into trouble. Thank you.